Bobcat returns to the firefighter, who pulled her from the flames as a cub. What she brings with her is unbelievable. In the scorched hills of Northern California, where blackened trees stood like skeletons and the air still carried the ghost of smoke, silence had settled like a blanket over a once thriving forest. Nature, battered and broken by flames, was trying to breathe again. And among those ashes, where everything looked lost, a firefighter named Cole Bennett had made a decision 2 years ago that would come back to him in a way he never imagined. Cole wasn't one for attention. The kind of guy who let his actions speak louder than words. He'd grown up with the woods in his blood, raised by a single mom who taught him how to split wood, track deer, and respect the land. So when wildfires ripped through his home state, Cole didn't hesitate. He signed up, pulled double shifts, and ran toward the flames when everyone else was running the other way. The job wasn't about heroism. It was about duty, about showing up no matter what. It was during one of those fires, an aggressive blaze near Ridge Hollow, that something happened. Something small, but it stayed with him. He and his crew had been clearing a smoldering patch of underbrush when he heard it. A high-pitched scream, not human but desperate. He froze, listening. The others didn't hear it over the crackle of flames and the roar of wind, but he did. Pushing deeper into the smoke, Cole found the source. Curled at the base of a burning log, a tiny ball of fur quivered, barely breathing. A baby bobcat. Its ears were scorched at the tips, eyes wide with terror, body trembling from heat and fear. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, too young to fend for itself, and clearly separated from its mother, if she was even alive. Cole didn't think. He just acted. Scooping the cub gently into his jacket, he cradled it close and ran, ducking through falling ash and twisted trees, dodging collapsing branches until he reached the engine. His captain gave him a look, but said nothing. They both knew the rules. Wildlife was supposed to be left to animal control or natural selection. But something about this cub, the way it clung to life, the way it looked at him, made it impossible to leave behind. After the fire, Cole handed the cub off to a licensed wildlife rehab center 2 towns over. He didn't stick around for updates. He didn't name her. He told himself it was better that way, cleaner. He'd done what he could, now it was someone else's turn. But even so, in quiet moments, he sometimes wondered if she'd made it. If that spark of life he'd seen in her eyes had survived the trauma. He moved on. He fought more fires, worked long hours, helped evacuate towns, rescued dogs and goats and elderly folks who refused to leave. But he never forgot that little cub. He never expected to see her again. And yet, on a cold December morning 2 years later, something strange happened. Cole had just come off a night shift and was walking the wooded path near his cabin, a small place tucked near the edge of the forest, quiet, remote. The fog hung low, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. He liked the stillness out there. It helped him think, helped him breathe. That morning, as he rounded a bend near the creek, he stopped. Something was watching him. At first, he thought it was a coyote, but then it stepped forward, slow and deliberate, eyes glowing faintly in the mist. A bobcat, fully, grown now, lean, muscular, and beautiful in a wild, uncontainable way. But there was something familiar about her, something in the way she moved, the way she stopped and stared without flinching. Cole's breath caught. No way. But then she made a sound, a soft, short, chuffing noise, and he knew. It was her, the cub from the fire, the one he'd carried in his jacket, soot clinging to her whiskers. She was here 2 years later, standing before him in the fog like a living memory. He didn't move, he didn't speak. He just stood there, stunned, heart pounding. She didn't run. Instead, she looked down. And that's when he noticed something. Behind her. Movement. A second figure, smaller, shakier, another cub. His knees almost gave out. She had brought her baby, the same way he had once carried her from danger. Now she had returned, bringing new life with her. And whatever this was, this moment, it was about to change everything. Cole didn't know how long he stood there, frozen. The cold air pressed against his skin, but he hardly felt it. His gaze flicked between the grown bobcat, her wild amber eyes steady on his, and the tiny cub at her feet half hidden in the frost-bitten grass. It was surreal. The forest was quiet, holding its breath like it too sensed the weight of this moment, and Cole, a man who had faced roaring infernos and collapsing trees, suddenly felt the kind of awe that didn't come from fear, but from something far deeper: reverence. The cub behind her was hesitant, smaller than she had been when he first found her. Its fur was thick and dappled with white patches of winter, its ears too big for its head, and its legs shaky with each step. It stared up at him, blinking slowly, then moved closer to its mother, brushing against her leg for reassurance. The mother, his bobcat, didn't flinch. She simply glanced back at the cub, then returned her gaze to Cole. Why was she here? It didn't make sense. Wild animals didn't just show up after years, they didn't bring their young to humans. And yet here she was, not out of fear, not out of habit. This was a choice. Cole took a slow, cautious step forward, unsure if she'd bolt, but she didn't. She remained still, her muscles relaxed, her breathing calm. Her tail flicked once, then settled. The cub, on the other hand, took a few nervous steps backward, only to be gently nudged forward again by her. It was like she was introducing them. Cole crouched, his knees creaking from the cold and from years of punishing fireline work. He extended one gloved hand, not to touch, he knew better than that, but as a gesture, a way of saying, "I remember you." The bobcat blinked slowly. Then, to his absolute astonishment, she did something he never expected. She sat just like that, sat in the snow, her cub beside her, as if she'd come to rest after a long journey, as if she trusted him completely. Cole's throat tightened. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears. This wasn't just an animal showing up at his doorstep. This was something else, something deeper, a loop being closed, a thread of fate tugging two stories together. But something about the cub's movements caught his attention. It wasn't just nervous, it was limping slightly, almost too subtle to catch, but he'd seen injuries before. He stood up gently and took a half-step closer. That's when she stood again, too, ears flicking, not aggressively, more protective. "I'm not trying to hurt him," he murmured, his voice low and calm. "I just want to help." The cub lowered itself into the grass again, breathing faster now. Cole could see it more clearly. Its front paw was swollen. There was a small, raw wound on the side. It wasn't life-threatening yet, but in the wild, something like that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. "She brought him here on purpose," Cole whispered to himself. "She remembers." It made no logical sense, and yet every part of him knew it was true. She had remembered where she had once been saved, and in her own instinctual, unexplainable way, she had returned for the same reason, not for herself, but for her cub. Cole stood there for a long time, trying to decide what to do. He knew approaching would spook her if he pushed too fast. And even if he did get a better look, he couldn't just drag the cub inside, not without risking panic, injury, or worse, losing both of them. So he did what he always did during wildfire rescues. He started with trust. He backed up slowly, hands raised, and walked back to his cabin. Every step away felt like he was breaking a thread between them, but he didn't look back until he reached his porch. When he turned, they were still there. He went inside and opened the shed next to his cabin, pulling out his emergency wildlife first aid kit, a leftover from his volunteer work with a local rescue group. He set down a shallow dish of water, some cooked chicken from the fridge, and a soft fleece towel. Then he brought them outside. He didn't place them near the bobcats directly. He simply laid them down a few yards away on the path where they could choose. Then he waited. The mother, Bobcat, didn't move right away. But after several minutes, she nudged the cub forward again. Slowly, painfully, the cub approached the food and sniffed it. After a moment's hesitation, it began to eat, its tiny body trembling with relief. The mother stayed close, eyes always on Cole, but she didn't interfere. He sat on his porch in silence, watching them eat, the sun rising higher behind him. The snow sparkled like crushed glass, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel alone. He didn't even notice the cold anymore, he just watched. That night they didn't leave. He checked again just before bed, stepping onto the porch with a flashlight, and there they were, Curled up in the clearing beside his firewood stack, the cub tucked close to his mother's chest. They had chosen to stay, but Cole also knew that meant something more was coming. The cub wasn't well, and nature was harsh. If he didn't act soon, this reunion could turn into a tragedy. Cole didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mother bobcat curled beside her injured cub, nestled in the shadows behind his firewood stack. It wasn't just the oddity of their presence that kept him awake, it was the weight of responsibility. That cub was hurt, and without intervention, nature would not be kind. Coyotes roamed these parts at night. Cold snapped harder before dawn. Infection spread faster in wild animals, and no matter how strong its mother was, she couldn't fix a swollen paw or stop a fever. By 4 a.m., Cole was up, moving quietly around the cabin. He brewed coffee not because he needed it, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. Then, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders, he stepped onto the porch and looked out. The firewood pile was silent, half sunken in moonlight. But then, movement. A small flicker of ears, a shifting of shadows. They were still there. Still alive. He sighed, stepping back inside. He had to make a decision. Let nature take its course, like some people would say. Or step in, once again crossing that invisible line between wild and human. But he already knew the answer. He'd crossed that line years ago, when he first picked up the tiny, scorched cub from the ash-covered ground. And now that same cub had come back. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a second call to action. By sunrise, he had a plan. Not a perfect one, but something. He knew from experience that trying to trap or grab a wild animal, especially one with a protective parent, was a recipe for disaster. So instead, he began building trust, the same way he had before. He set up a larger, more enclosed area in his woodshed, cleared of tools and lined with thick blankets and soft straw. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, dry, and safe. He placed more food and water just inside the open door and left a trail. Tiny pieces of chicken, spaced a few feet apart, leading from the firewood stack to the shed entrance. It was a gamble, but it was the only way to guide them without force. Then he waited. Again. The hours passed slowly. He worked in the yard, pretending not to watch, but every few minutes he glanced toward the path. Midday came and went. The food remained untouched. Doubt started to creep in, but around late afternoon, when the forest light turned golden, something changed. First, the mother appeared. She emerged from the stack with her cub limping beside her, eyes wary, body tense. She sniffed the air. Then, she looked directly at Cole, not with fear, not with threat, just awareness. And then she turned to her cub and gave it a gentle nudge forward. Cole didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just watched. The cub sniffed the first bit of chicken, then the next. Slowly, cautiously, the pair followed the trail, step by step, until they reached the shed entrance. The mother paused. The cub looked back unsure. Then, to Cole's disbelief, she stepped inside. Not all the way, but just far enough to examine the interior. Then she turned and made a small sound, something between a grunt and a chuff, and the cub followed her in. Cole waited another hour just to be sure. Then gently, slowly, he stepped up and lowered the door, not to trap them, but to block out the cold and give them privacy. It was happening. They had come to him willingly. Trust had been built again. Inside the cabin that night, the storm finally broke. Snow lashed the windows, and wind howled through the trees. But Cole didn't feel the chill, not with the soft sounds coming from the shed, the shuffling of straw, the occasional mewl of the cub, the reassuring rustle of movement. They were safe, for now. By the next morning, Cole had made a decision. He called a contact, an old friend named Travis who worked with a local wildlife rehabilitation group. It was a risk, bringing someone into this fragile situation, but Cole knew he couldn't do this alone. The cub needed a proper evaluation. If there was infection or internal damage, waiting too long could be fatal. Travis arrived by noon. They kept their voices low, their movements careful. Through a small crack in the shed wall, they observed the cub. Its paw was worse, swollen, red around the edges. But it was alert and still eating. That was a good sign. The mother kept a close watch but didn't lash out or flee. She seemed to understand that this was help, not harm. "I've seen animals come back before," Travis murmured. "But not like this. Not with a cub. This is something different, Cole. You didn't just rescue her, you became part of her instinct map. That doesn't happen every day." Together, they planned a gentle intervention. They'd sedate the cub with a small dosage. Mixed in food. Not enough to harm, just enough to relax it. The mother would stay nearby but not be restrained. It was risky, but it was the only way to act without destroying the fragile trust they had built. As twilight settled over the trees once more, they prepared the food and stepped back. Minutes passed. Then, as if understanding more than any human could imagine, the mother bobcat let her cub step forward toward the bowl. Cole's breath caught. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about faith. About one wild creature placing her trust in a man who had once saved her, believing, hoping that he would now do the same for her child. And Cole was determined not to let her down. The sedative worked slower than expected. Cole and Travis watched from the side of the woodshed, hearts thudding in unison, as the small bobcat cub, now halfway through the meal, began to wobble slightly. Its limbs grew heavier, its eyes blinked slower. The mother bobcat stayed close, her ears twitching with unease, but she didn't interfere. If she sensed the shift in her cub's demeanor, she didn't show panic. Instead, she sat protectively by, her eyes flicking between the cub and the two men hidden just beyond the wall. Travis whispered, "Now or never." They moved quickly. With gloves and gentle precision, they entered the shed. Cole's heart was racing. The mother growled low but didn't attack. Her tail flicked once, then she backed into the shadows. She was watching but not stopping them. Cole bent down and carefully lifted the drowsy cub into a padded transport crate Travis had brought. The cub whimpered once but didn't struggle. The sedation had worked just enough to make the transfer safe. Back at the house, the small kitchen had been turned into an impromptu exam room. Travis examined the cub under a soft yellow lamp, while Cole hovered nearby, gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "It's a puncture wound," Travis murmured, gently turning the paw. "Something sharp. Probably a splintered branch or rusted wire. Infection set in, but we caught it in time. Some antibiotics, fluids, careful rest. He'll pull through." Cole let out a shaky breath, realizing just how tense he'd been. "She brought him to me because she knew. Somehow she knew I could help." Travis nodded. "That's not just instinct, that's memory. You marked her life forever when you saved her. Looks like she returned the favor by trusting you with the most precious thing she has." The treatment took nearly 2 hours. All the while, the mother remained outside the shed, never venturing far, never making a sound, but always there. When they finally returned the cub, now groggy but stable, to the warmth of the woodshed, Cole placed the crate gently near the corner and opened the door. Moments later, the mother stepped forward, nudged the cub's face softly with her nose, and let out a sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a purr. It was something in between, something ancient and intimate. She looked up at Cole for a long moment, her golden eyes reflecting the porch light like polished coins. Then, without a sound, she curled up beside her cub. Cole didn't dare move. He simply stepped back, eyes burning, and let the night take over. Days passed with a rhythm both fragile and miraculous. The cub slowly recovered, feeding better, limping less, regaining strength. Cole checked on them twice a day from a distance, replenishing food and water, watching the mother with careful respect. Travis returned every other day to administer medicine, always keeping things quiet, always staying low, but something else was changing too. The boundary between man and wild was blurring. The mother bobcat no longer flinched when Cole approached. One morning, as he left fresh chicken by the shed door, she walked out and stood just 10 feet away, meeting his gaze fully. It wasn't defiance, it was acknowledgement. And then came the moment that would shift everything. It was a bitter, grey morning when the cub finally ventured outside. His limp was almost gone, his energy clearly returned. He stumbled forward into the soft snow, ears perked, tail twitching. The mother followed closely behind, but she didn't stop him. She was letting him explore, letting him stretch into the world again. Cole watched from the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, silent as stone. But what happened next left him frozen. The cub turned, looked straight at him. Then, slowly, awkwardly, he padded toward the porch steps. He stopped just before the first one, sniffed the air, then sat down, watching. Cole stood still, not daring to move. Behind him, the mother bobcat stepped forward too. She didn't follow the cub all the way, but she came far enough that her body was fully exposed in the morning light. She let out a short, soft chuffing sound. It wasn't a warning. It was a message. "He's ready," Cole whispered aloud, realizing what this was. The mother bobcat had returned not only to seek help, but to show him what that help had created. A healthy cub, surviving, thriving, strong. She hadn't come back for herself. She'd come back to share this moment, to close a circle. And that's when it hit him. She was going to leave. That night, Cole stayed up late, checking the shed again and again. But by morning, the enclosure was empty. No paw prints, no trail, just a faint indentation in the straw where the cub had last slept. They were gone. And for the first time in a long time, Cole felt a strange peace, not the kind that comes with silence, but the kind that comes with knowing you did the right thing. That trust had been given and not broken, that somewhere out there in the deep woods behind his cabin, two wild lives were moving freely again. But that wasn't the last he'd see of them, not by a long shot. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence it left behind was louder than any storm. Cole stood at the edge of his porch that morning, coffee mug half frozen in his grip, staring out into the woods with a strange ache in his chest. The bobcat and her cub had vanished overnight, leaving nothing behind but a soft depression in the straw and a hollow stillness in the air. He hadn't realized just how much their presence had filled the long, empty spaces of his life until they were gone. Travis had checked in that afternoon, just to confirm the cub's recovery was complete. They walked the perimeter of the property together, but there were no tracks, no signs, just pristine snow stretching in every direction. She waited until he was strong enough, Travis said, his voice quiet but sure. Then she did what wild animals do. She moved on. Cole nodded, though a knot in his throat made it hard to speak. But she didn't have to come here, he finally said. She could have left that cub to fate. But she remembered me, Travis. She chose this place. Travis looked at him, then gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Because you saved her. Once. And she knew you'd do it again. The days that followed returned to their usual rhythm. Mornings filled with splitting wood and tending the stove. Afternoons with long hikes through snow-blanketed trails, keeping his hands busy and his mind quiet. But the ghost of those golden eyes lingered everywhere, in the quiet woodshed, in the creak of the porch at night, even in the dreams that came uninvited, showing him flashes of fur and fire and trust hard-earned in the wild. 2 weeks passed, and winter began to ease its grip on the land. The ice on the edges of the stream started to break. A few birds had returned, chirping nervously from high branches. The thawing world breathed, and Cole with it. Then came the sound that pulled him out of a late afternoon nap like a punch to the chest, a sharp, familiar scrape against the woodshed door. At first he thought he'd dreamed it. But there it was again. He rushed out, heart pounding, eyes sweeping across the yard, and froze. She was back. The mother bobcat stood at the edge of the woodshed, her body dusted in snow, her tail twitching slowly, her eyes locked with his, calm and steady. But this time she wasn't alone. Trailing behind her, half hidden in the snowdrifts, were 2 more cubs, not the one he had helped heal. These were new, smaller, clumsier, likely born in the early days of spring. One tumbled forward, mewling softly, before scrambling back behind its sibling. Cole didn't move. He barely breathed. The mother bobcat stepped aside, allowing the cubs to move forward slightly, her gaze never leaving Cole's face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't caution. It was intent. Purpose. As if she'd brought them here to show him something. He took a slow step forward, and then stopped. The cubs startled, but the mother didn't react. She stood tall and still like a guardian allowing a visitation. And then, to Cole's complete disbelief, the original cub, the one he'd nursed back to health, stepped out from the trees. But he was no longer a cub. He was larger now, stronger. His gait was confident but respectful. His coat was glossy and thick, and he moved like the forest belonged to him. His eyes met Cole's and held them, and in that silent recognition something old and wordless passed between them. Gratitude, familiarity, and something else. Trust not just earned but sustained over time and distance. The young bobcat padded up beside his mother, brushed his body briefly against her side, then turned toward the porch, toward Cole. He didn't come close, didn't break the boundary of instinct, but he sat, right there in the open, watching, waiting. Cole didn't speak. He didn't need to. He crouched slowly, hands on his knees, and simply looked back. And then the mother bobcat did something no one would believe if he told them. She sat too. There, in the clearing between man and wild, she folded her legs beneath her and let her cubs climb over her back, licking their tiny faces with soft, deliberate care. She was at peace, and she'd chosen this moment, this spot, this man, to share it with. It was more than acknowledgement. It was a gift. They stayed like that for several minutes, an impossible scene stitched together by fire, memory, and something deeper than instinct. When the sun began to lower behind the ridge, painting everything in gold, the mother finally stood. The cubs followed her. The young bobcat gave Cole one last look, soft, even curious, then turned and disappeared into the woods behind them. Cole stood there for a long time, alone but not lonely, cold but warm in every way that mattered. He understood something now that he hadn't before. The rescue 2 years ago hadn't just saved a cub, it had changed a path. It had planted a seed in the wild that, against all odds, had grown into a bridge, a bond that time didn't weaken, a connection that even silence couldn't undo. That night, Cole sat by the fire and opened his old leather journal. He hadn't written in it for months, but now with a trembling hand he turned to a fresh page and wrote, "She remembered, and she trusted me again. I don't need anyone else to believe it. I know what I saw, what I felt. Some debts in nature are repaid, not in words or gestures, but in the simple act of showing up. Today she brought her cubs to me, not for help, not for food, but for trust. That's the kind of moment that makes a life mean something." He closed the book, leaned back, and listened to the forest breathe. Somewhere out there, a bobcat and her young ones moved silently through the trees, wild and free. But he had been part of their story, and they had been part of his. In a world full of noise and distance, one act of kindness had created something quiet, rare, and unforgettable. And in the stillness of that winter night, he felt it again, that soft chuffing sound. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was the wind, or maybe, just maybe, it was goodbye.